Friends, I'm so happy to welcome everybody here today. Today, as you know, is Yom HaZikaron, but in Israel, we're in the twilight between Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Memorial Day and Israel's Independence Day. And there's dynamic tension and an energy, excuse me, let me mute my phone, between these two days and the experience. When we invited Gershom Gorenberg, our speaker today, to speak today, it was we wanted someone to frame the day for us, and this is part of our Israel Week programming. To be quite honest, Gershom, I was praying you would say yes, but I thought, like, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, like, nah, there's no way he would do it. And part of the reason why you were the person in particular that we wanted to invite to speak today is because what we find in your book, War of Shadows, which I highly recommend, is if it wasn't for the story that you're going to tell us today through your amazing research, there really wouldn't, there's very good chance that we would only have a Yom HaZikaron today and no Yom Ha'atzmaut. The story we're about to hear is really amazing. The book is had me on the edge of my seat. And so let me just, our speaker today is a historian and journalist who's covered the Middle East for over 35 years. He's written 3 critically acclaimed books: The Unmaking of Israel, The Accidental Empire, and The End of Days. And he also won the National Jewish Book Award for his book on the life and legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. He is a columnist for the Washington Post and a senior correspondent for the American Prospect. And there's a chance we might get to meet you in person if your plans work out, that you'll be in America, in New York at Columbia, teaching this summer at the School of Journalism. So today's talk is about his book, War of Shadows, Codebreakers, Spies, and the secret struggle to drive the Nazis from the Middle East. In the twilight between Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut, there's no better person on the planet to address us at this time, and we're so grateful to welcome you to the Park Avenue Synagogue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rabbi. I hope the screen share is working and you can see my slides. A tiny bit of a preamble before I start the full story. As the Rabbi said, this is the end of Israeli Memorial Day for the Fallen. My book is dedicated to forgotten heroes, and in the course of this talk, I will mention a few, but I want to start with one who sticks in my mind, and that is a man named Eliyahu, or Ernst Gottlieb. He was born in Berlin and brought by his parents to Jerusalem in 1933. He signed up with the British Army on his 3rd try in 1942, claiming to be 19 years old. He volunteered for a special commando unit made up of German-speaking Jews from Palestine who learned to impersonate German soldiers, and he died in a raid on a Luftwaffe base in Libya in June of 1942 at the age of 17. Yehi Zichro Baruch. I'd like to start the main body of the talk with a question that you can answer via chat, which is, how many of you had a parent or grandparent who served in North Africa during World War II, or a member of your family who was living in North Africa or the Middle East during the war? You can share your comments via chat, and maybe even I will find where to get the chat to go on here. Yes, here it is. So I see one comment already, whose grandfather served in North Africa. Anybody else? Okay, I get a lot more answers to this question when I speak to an audience in Britain or in South Africa. We do have a couple here. The reality is that the American memory of the war against Germany tends to leap from Pearl Harbor to D-Day to we won. And yet, for 3 years, more than half of the war, North Africa was where the British and then Allied forces fought Italy and Germany. And not only that, the real story of the decisive battle is the story of an intelligence breakthrough, of an espionage breakthrough, and that's either missing or very fragmentary in previous accounts of the war. The heroes of this story have been erased, and not by accident. And in order to understand this, I want to take you on time travel, on a guided tour of the past. Now, this is one of those guided tours that hops from one landmark to another, and in this case, from one time to another, so please stay with the guide. Our first stop is going to be Central Cairo on the 1st of July, 1942. And if you're standing in front of this cafe, looking at the department stores and apartment buildings of a city that was built to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you look west toward the Nile, you'll see pillars of smoke rising from British General Headquarters, Middle East, from the British Embassy, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, from the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, which is the secret agency that supports the resistance in Nazi-occupied countries, because clerks and soldiers are burning papers, code books, plans, maps, orders. The fires are so hot that some of the documents don't burn. They're carried up by the heat, and secret documents float out over the city. If you want to take cash out of the bank, as so many people do, you're going to find lines down the block and the tellers handing out worn-out bills for lack of new ones. There's also long lines outside the shops selling luggage. A British code officer, a young British code officer by the name of June Watkins, finishes her shift in the Royal Air Force code room in the basement of a downtown hotel that morning. And she meets a friend, a South African officer on the street, who offers to take her for coffee at the favorite hangout of British officer Grumpy's Garden Cafe. But when they get there, the garden is closed, and they have to drink inside. And she goes down to the ladies' room and looks out the window, and she sees that out in the garden, waiters are painting signs in German, greeting the officers of Erwin Rommel's Axis army. At the train station, the scene is like that in the movie Casablanca of the Paris train station on the eve of the German conquest, except without the rain. The Cairo train station is packed with people fleeing south to Sudan or trying to get on the overnight train east to Palestine. The British Army reserves seats for 1,600 civilians who are in danger because they worked for the British authorities. It includes 100 Italian German Jews who worked as translators or agents for the British. But the British authorities in Palestine don't want to let them in because the 1939 British White Paper drastically limits Jewish immigration. The Turkish embassy in Cairo radios its Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ankara. And it says that the number of Egyptian Jews who want visas for Turkey is increasing every day. What should we do? Let us know what our policy should be. And they get a radiogram back that says, tell them no. Now, you're reading Turkish radiograms in English. Why is that? That's because these radio messages were intercepted by British wireless operators, decoded and translated by the agency, the British agency known as the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, an agency that was so secret that its very existence was not known to the public. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, you saw a highly inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke the German Enigma code. It also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 countries, including Turkey, and for that matter, also including US diplomatic codes. In any case, on the 1st of July, 1942, everybody knows in Cairo that they face the same fate as Paris or Belgrade or Warsaw, of all those other cities that have been taken by the Axis. And to understand, let's look at the map. What had happened is that 10 days earlier, the Axis army, the German and Italian army under General Erwin Rommel, had taken the small port of Tobruk in Cyrenaica, which is to say eastern Libya. And in the intervening 10 days, Rommel advanced 350 miles to a spot in the Egyptian desert called El Alamein. The British Eighth Army appears to be on the edge of collapse. It's only 60 miles further to Alexandria. let's stop for a second and talk about this man, Erwin Rommel. Do any of you have any associations? You can answer me in chat if you like. Any associations with the name Rommel? Anything that comes to your mind when you hear Erwin Rommel? Well, Rommel was the most famous of the German generals. In World War II, he became the personification of blitzkrieg, of fast mobile warfare. He wrote a memoir of his time in North Africa that was called War Without Hate, describing the war as just soldiers involved in a deadly game, which completely ignored the fact that there were civilians who lived in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. The post-war story that grew up around Rommel was that he was a good German. His suicide after he was alleged, and I stress the word alleged, to have taken part in a coup against Hitler in 1944 added to this reputation. So hold on to the name Rommel, but we're still in the summer of 1942. And let's look at that map again. You can see that Palestine was a very uncertain refuge because Jerusalem is barely further from El Alamein than El Alamein is from Tobruk. In fact, the expectation among Jews in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, is Rommel is coming. This is frightening, but the meaning, remember, put yourself in that moment without knowing what happened later. The meaning was unclear to the Jews of Egypt and Palestine. On the one hand, there had been a late June report from London based on information smuggled out of Poland to the Polish government in exile that over 700,000 Polish Jews had been murdered in Poland. The report noted that many of them had been killed in mobile gas chambers carried on trucks. With that information and information gathered from elsewhere in occupied Europe, the World Jewish Congress on the 30th of June put out a report that said 1 million Jews have been slain by the Nazis in occupied Europe. Now, this is how that item appeared in the New York Times on page 7 next to the Saks Fifth Avenue ads. If you think that this is some sort of the New York Times ignoring the fate of Jews, don't read it that way. The Times editors were not alone in being doubtful about the veracity of the report. In fact, the Tel Aviv Hebrew newspaper Hatzofeh ran an editorial against reporting these numbers. It said these items come as rumors taken from the air, passed from one informant to another, one writer to another. It's causing despair to publish these rumors. So for the 75,000 Jews in Egypt and the 500,000 or more Jews in Palestine, the fear of Rommel does not actually match the full threat. They don't know that in Libya, under orders from Mussolini, the authorities are already trucking the Jews of Cyrenaica of eastern Libya to a concentration camp in the desert. They don't know that the SS is confident of Rommel's victory and has already set up an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing team for the Middle East. On that same day, July 1st, 1942, the commander of this team is appointed. His name is Walter Rauff. He's a top SS officer, and his orders are to carry out, quote, executive measures, unquote. That's SS bureaucracies for mass murder against the Jews of Egypt. And once Rommel advances, Rauff's targets will be the Jews of Palestine. If he realizes his plans to advance to the Iraqi oil fields, the 25,000 Jews of Syria and Lebanon and the 100,000 in Iraq will also be targets. To understand what happened next at El Alamein, we need to travel in time again. We need to go back nearly 3 years to the first week of September 1939, to the train tracks of Poland, and to look at 2 trains, one entering and one leaving. The first train left Berlin, headed into Poland on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion. It was Hitler's private train. He wanted to see his armies in the process of conquest. He had a battalion in charge of his personal security, and in command of that battalion was Hitler's favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes to his wife that he had been allowed to sit next to Hitler at lunch, and that he, Rommel, quote, was allowed to chat almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. Rommel writes, quote, he is extraordinarily friendly toward me, unquote. Rommel worships Hitler. At the very same time, that first week of September 1939, the head of the SS and the Gestapo, Reinhard Heydrich, tells the head of German military intelligence, Wilhelm Canaris, that, quote, the nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews of Poland must be killed, unquote. There is similar testimony of Nazi plans from an officer, a German officer who served under the German Chief of Army Staff, Franz Halder. This officer wrote that some of what he heard from Halder was too awful to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether Rommel did or did not know the meaning of German victories. But in any case, Rommel is elated to watch the invasion of Poland. It fits his idea of rapid warfare, of armored divisions breaking through enemy defenses. But for that kind of warfare, tanks weren't the only machine that needed, because headquarters needed to be in direct touch with the commanders of the tank forces, who needed to be in contact with the units under them. And the only way to do that was by radio. But sending battle plans by radio is shouting them out to the world. As the historian John Ferris wrote, only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not. You had to, and yet it gave you away. So you had to encrypt, you had to encode your messages. But traditional codes and ciphers were too easy to break. In a cipher, one letter replaces another. So if Z is the most common letter in an enciphered message, you know that it stands for E. But what if the cipher changed with each letter in the message? What if you typed EEE and it came out TZQ and so on, seemingly randomly? The solution, the thing that allowed the Germans to do this, was a machine put on the market by a Berlin company in the early 1920s, originally for business use, called the Enigma. You can see that there's a keyboard. Behind it is a board with letters of the alphabet, a light under each letter, under each letter on the light board. And then behind that are three wheels, three turning geared wheels. Each wheel has 26 contacts on each side, and wires inside connect the contacts on one side of the wheel to the other, but not straight across. Contact number 1 can be connected to any of the 26 on the other side, and contact number 2 to any of the remaining 25. You press a letter on the keyboard, say B, a signal runs through all three wheels, through another tangle of wires at the other end, and then to the light board, and any letter but B lights up. And at the same time, with each key that you press, the wheels turn, so the pattern changes. If you type BBB, it comes out as something different each time. The code clerk takes down the letters that are lighting up, and he radios that. The beauty of the machine is it's the size of a typewriter. It weighs 15 pounds. You can carry it in a command car. To decipher an encrypted message, you type in the coded message that you got, and the clear text lights up on the light board. That is, if you have a machine that's wired in the same way, and you know all of the settings, all of the starting positions of the Enigma on which the machine was encoded. Now, the number of possible settings on the military version of Enigma was 150 quintillion. That's the small number. The number of ways to wire the wheels comes out to about this number, a 5 followed by 92 zeros. It is completely obvious to the Germans, and in fact to their enemies, that no one can ever test so many combinations, that there's no mathematical solution, that this is what we call today secure end-to-end encryption. But I said we were going to talk about 2 trains in Poland. The second train leaves Warsaw on September 6, 1939, headed east to escape the German forces, and on board is the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel. His name is Marian Rejewski. Marian Rejewski is 34 years old. 10 years before, while working on his master's degree in math at a Polish university, he was recruited by Poland's military intelligence cypher bureau, the agency in charge of breaking codes. In autumn of 1932, he was assigned to the impossible task of breaking Enigma. He applied something known as permutation theory, which in hindsight is the obvious mathematical approach. It's obvious once you've heard of it, no one else looked at it that way. By January of 1933, he had calculated the wirings, and then he and 2 assistants found ways to find the settings. But as war approached, the Germans were changing the settings every day, and Ryuski and his two assistants couldn't keep up. In July of 1939, they invited two British cryptologists from the ultra-secret GCHQ to Warsaw and shared their work. In September of 1939, after the German invasion, Ryuski escapes via Romania. He reaches France and he continues to advise the British. The best of Britain's codebreakers never believed that Ryuski figured out the wiring on his own, because that was impossible. They thought that the Poles must have stolen an intact Enigma machine. But all of Britain's work afterwards, breaking Enigma, was based on Ryuski's work. Okay, ready to travel? We're going to go on the same date to a different place. We're still at the beginning of September 1939, but while Ryuski is fleeing, GCHQ settles into its new location, an estate called Bletchley Park, a hideous mansion on the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge in the British countryside. Among the people moving in are Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician, yes, eccentric, but the fact that he was sent on delicate missions to parallel agencies in France and the United States casts doubts on the popular picture of him as seen in The Imitation Game. Based on Ryuski's work, Turing designed a giant machine that would run through at high speed different Enigma settings, looking for one that could have produced a particular text in an encoded messages. For this to work, you needed to have a good idea of words that would appear in the message, what was called a crib. That is, it depended on the Germans ignoring basic code security and using the same phrases over and over again, and the Germans being certain that this didn't matter because they had unbreakable end-to-end encryption. Another person moving into Bletchley Park was Gordon Welchman, also a Cambridge mathematician and ethereal academician. Besides coming up with a design fix that made Turing's machine actually work, Welchman's really big idea was that code breaking was no longer work for a genius alone in a small room. It was no longer the work of academics. He proposed turning code breaking into an industry, dividing day-to-day code breaking from research into new codes, going over to 3 shifts a day, dividing up the tasks. Bletchley Park goes from 100 or so staffers when the war began to thousands later on. Essentially, it was a high-tech startup before the term was invented, and Welchman discovered that he was a manager, a mover, a problem solver, and never returned to academia. At first, with the help of the Poles in Paris, Bletchley Park begins to find Enigma settings and reading messages. It's not a one-time break. You need to break the settings each day, and constantly the Germans were setting up new networks, each with its own settings. So you had to break those, and then you had to translate the messages and make sense out of them. Let's get back in our time machine. We're going to move forward to the summer of 1941. We're still at Bletchley Park. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. British radio operators are hearing messages sent by German units, including special police units. Bletchley Park has broken the police code, and here are 2 of the messages that are translated. Note that the number is circled in red. Churchill got a selection daily of decoded messages from Bletchley Park. Churchill always wrote in red ink, so the red circle here means that you're seeing the fact that Churchill took note of the number. Here's another message from August 1941. The Germans are moving through Soviet territory, and they are committing mass murder against Jews. But at Bletchley Park, they don't know the full numbers. These are scattered bits of a larger picture. However, the full reports are pouring into SS headquarters in Berlin. And by September of 1941, Heydrich decides that shooting Jews is wearing down the SS and the police. He wants a more efficient way aside. He wants to use trucks that transport and kill at the same time, and he assigns the job of producing these mobile gas chambers to the head of the SS technical arm, the very same Walter Rauff. By November of 1941, Rauff has a prototype, and the estimates of the number of people who were eventually killed in these trucks begin at 500,000 and go up from there. Let's get back on the time machine. We're still at Bletchley Park. It's April of 1942. Welchman's team has finally broken into the Enigma networks used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters in Africa. And this message is reported from what's called a good source. And it says that the British will not be ready for an offensive in Libya until June 1st. This is incredible intelligence. This tells Rommel as a general that he has until June 1st to preempt a British attack. The message is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story, who had been recruited 2 years before by GCHQ as an untrained clerk. Joining GCHQ transformed her life because by 1942, the success at breaking German messages was getting into British commanders' nightmares. If we're breaking their messages, what's happening to our messages? Are they deciphering it? So in the spring of 1942, Story is made the research specialist in charge of finding hints of enemy intelligence in decoded Enigma messages. I can't show you her picture. She left almost no trace in her life but her work. It took me many, many months to find people who had known her. They told me, picture her as slight, as always wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking, as self-effacing, introspective, very intelligent, as having daunting intelligence, as having absolutely formidable intelligence, as being shy, very shy, as the brain, as speaking 9 languages. Well, more messages follow, citing the good source. This is one of Story's reports. The good source in Cairo is telling the Germans about British positions, plans, and mistakes. Rommel supposedly was seen at the time as having some sort of ESP about British plans, but in fact, his sixth sense was the best intelligence source the Axis had during the entire war. Here's one such message. This message from the 11th of June 1942 says that British commandos intend to attack aircraft at 9 Axis aerodromes, at 9 Axis air bases on the night of the 12th and 13th of June with sabotage units. This warning led to high alert at the German air bases and to the death of Eliyahu Gottlieb and the death or capture of his comrades in that commando team. So Bletchley Park wants to know who or what is the good source and how do we stop it? In retrospect, the suspects included the possibility that a spy had been brought to Egypt by Laszlo Almasi, the Hungarian desert explorer and German intelligence officer, who was turned into a highly fictionalized romantic character in the book and movie The English Patient. So perhaps Almasi had brought spies to Egypt, or perhaps the spy was King Farouk of Egypt or somebody close to him. Farouk was 22 years old, was known to have pro-Axis leanings. It turned out later that he had learned in advance of the British invasion of Persia in 1941 and warned Germany. In fact, in February of 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt put together a coup to force Farouk to appoint a pro-Allied prime minister. But Farouk was still king, so maybe it's his circle. Or maybe it's a British code stolen from an embassy before the war. Before the war began, the number 2 in MI6, Britain's overseas intelligence agency, Major Valentine Vivian, had written scathing reports of security at the embassy, at the British embassy in Berlin, that said that the Gestapo could break in virtually every night to steal documents, possibly even including codebooks. So who was the good source? I'm going to leave that mystery for the book. Instead, I'm going to jump forward in time to June 21st, 1942. Rommel has just taken Tobruk. His orders are to stop at the Egyptian border, but then he gets a message from the good source in Cairo. The message says, if Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, this is a suitable moment. Rommel is a compulsive gambler who just got an inside tip. Egypt is ready for the taking. He invades Egypt. He needs to get to Alexandria to have a port to receive supplies. He needs to get beyond Alexandria to Palestine, to the RAF bases there, to stop British air attacks on shipping bringing him supplies across the Mediterranean. The good source tells him that the British will mount their final defense of Egypt here at Mersa Matruh on the Egyptian coast. Well, through a careful comparison of Allied and Axis intelligence documents, including some that I found by locating the descendant of a key officer involved in this story, I found out that this is exactly when the good source was silenced. How? Again, I'll leave that for the book, but here's the important part. On June 25th, General Claude Auchinleck, the head of Britain's Middle East Command, changed his defensive plan and decided that the final line would be heading south from El Alamein. The reason for this is it's the narrowest point between the coast and cliffs that descend into a lowland called the Qatar Depression. By building his line at El Alamein, Auchinleck created a situation where Rommel could not outflank him, could not cut through the desert. He had to go directly into the British line. There's no more good source intelligence from Cairo. Rommel is clueless. He doesn't know this. He takes Mersa Matruh and he thinks the road is open almost completely. On June 30th, the medical officer of the Panzer Army of the German army in Africa tells the medical officers of the various divisions what they should do when they get to Alexandria and Cairo. Don't drink unboiled water. Don't buy ice cream from street vendors. They think they've already arrived. On July 1st, Rommel issues a message saying that, you know, we're just going to mop up this little remaining unit at El Alamein. He thinks that this is going to be a minor skirmish, not a real battle, and that he's going to go right through to Alexandria and Cairo and beyond. Instead, he meets a completely unexpected British defense. He's blocked after weeks of fighting. His armies cannot advance. Their supply lines are trucks on the road all the way back to Libya. On July 20th, Walter Rauff flies from Greece to Tobruk to El Alamein to meet Rommel's chief of staff to prepare to go into Egypt and Palestine, and instead is told, our advance on Cairo has to wait. We're short on supplies, especially fuel. Rauff's team is told to wait in Athens for Rommel to take the Nile. It never happens. El Alamein is quite literally the line in the sand where the Axis army is stopped. It takes until November before the British, under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, drive the Axis forces back. Churchill would call the battle in October and November the end of the beginning, the turning point of the war. In fact, the real end of the beginning, in hindsight, was July, when Rommel met that defense at El Alamein. Once he was stopped short of Alexandria, his army was doomed. There's a constant stream of deciphered Enigma messages that show that the Axis army is short of fuel, food, and supplies. He can't reach Alexandria. Hitler won't let him retreat. Reaching that point and not going forward was a trap. The victory in the secret war was the key to the victory at El Alamein. Rommel and the SS under Rauff never reached Cairo. And Rommel, of course, never knows of the role of Rayuski or Welchman or Turing or Margaret's story in his defeat. So why did this story remain hidden? Well, that has to do with a order that was issued just before VE Day to British, the small number of British officers and officials who knew of Enigma intelligence. And they are told that they must carry the secret for the rest of their lives. They must never speak of it, because there are several reasons that are given for this, but the first and most important reason that's given is that after World War I, the Germans created these stab-in-the-back conspiracy theories that somehow or another they had the better army, but they had been in some way betrayed. And this had been one of the major forces leading to World War II. So the British commanders say the Germans must not know of the role of intelligence in their defeat. They must believe that they were overwhelmed by pure superior force, and therefore those of you who fought the War of Shadows, you played an extraordinary role in the victory, and for the victory to last, history must not remember you. I'll finish with a few thoughts. First of all, Enigma could be broken because human beings designed it, and because another human being could look at the problem differently, and because human beings took shortcuts. People repeated phrases, they got careful. The flaw in the machine, in the technology, was the human beings who used it. Technology has changed greatly, but people haven't, and hence perfect security keeps failing. The second thing is that were it not for the victory at El Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo and Palestine. This is just one part, and there's more in the book In War of Shadows of how the standard picture of the Holocaust as being only in Europe is too narrow geographically. And also, this is just a small sampling of the intrigues that would shape the Middle East after the war. Just as a start, that 1942 coup in Egypt discredited King Farouk and served as the catalyst of the 1952 revolution that brought Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat to power in Egypt. So what happened in these events shaped the Middle East from then on until our day. I hope that I have honored the forgotten heroes, and I hope that you enjoy reading the full story. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to respond to your questions.
Wow. Let me first of all thank you for that presentation. It was a lot to digest, and I know we have a lot of questions. I want to begin with the burning question, which is, did the Jews in Israel, Palestine, know how close they were to being wiped out? I mean, like essentially.
Well, yes and no. As I said, at the time of these events, the full meaning of a German conquest wasn't known, and there were in fact debates in the top leadership of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, about whether or not to mount a partisan warfare, guerrilla warfare after the expected Nazi conquest. And there were some people who said, we have no hope of survival. The best we can do is to leave a legend of Masada by fighting back. And there were other people who said, surely some of us will die, but if we mount guerrilla warfare, they'll kill all of us and they won't otherwise. And when you read the minutes of these meetings, you realize they did not know what was going on in Europe at that time. They did not know what the full meaning of a German conquest was. Those reports from Poland, as the newspaper editorial showed you, were not trusted, even by the Jews in Palestine, much less by people elsewhere. It was only in the autumn of 1942 that reports that were fully trusted were smuggled out of occupied Europe, and the Western allies and the public realized what was going on in Europe when it became undeniable, when headlines started appearing in the Hebrew press as well of national mourning and of shock about what was going on in Europe. So ex post facto, b'diavad, people could realize after the victory at El Alamein how close they had come to destruction. But during the actual events, it was an immense amount of fear, but it was an unclear fear.
Let me ask you one other question, and then I know David Parker has a question that he put into the chat that I want to get to. And this is, what language was the Enigma machine in? So if you're the British trying to decode the German Enigma, was it written in English, German? What were they?
No. It's these are German messages between between German units. Besides being in German, they were also full of German jargon and abbreviations, and even things like a supply officer is sending a list to his commander of the supplies at his base. And he sends a list that says something like number 1, 320, number 2, 16, Number 3, 47. And they both know what's in place 1 and place 2 and place 3, but the British, when they're decoding it, have to figure that out. So even after you've decoded it and translated it, and a big part of what went on, there was one in the lawn of Bletchley Park, they built these temporary huts, these like factory-looking huts where the work went on. Hut 6 was where they did the decoding. Hut 3 was where they did the translating. But the people at Hut 3 discovered that even when they got the translated messages, they were only a quarter of the way there. They had to figure out what they meant. There were map coordinates that were only made sense on a German map, and they had to by just reading one message after another and putting together the clues, figure out what that meant. They created a card catalog of millions of cards with people's names and code names and place names that they could refer to each time they decoded a message, so that the work became little by little easier in understanding what these German messages were. Just one last thing to tell you about the translation process. There was a man who worked at Bletchley Park, a Jewish man who worked at Bletchley Park named Walter Ettenhouse, if I remember his original name properly, was a British Jew who'd grown up in Germany for reasons I can't remember at the moment, but he'd been recruited as a translator, which was an essential part of the process. And while working on a shift in Bletchley Park, he was the first person in the West to run into the phrase final solution in a translated German message. After the war, he ended up making Aliyah, and in the 1990s, he was the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. His name was Walter Eitan after he Hebraicized it.
So decoding the Enigma was really only the beginning, because they were just puzzle pieces.
Absolutely. The work involved in making sense of those messages was incredibly difficult. And I have to add, when I was reading about this puzzle, I identified with it because I was reading through British and German and Italian archival documents from the 1940s, and they're full of jargon, and they're full of abbreviations, and there's times marked on them, but it doesn't tell you it's the time of what, when it was sent or when it was received or when something happened. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm lining up these little pieces and saying, well, if it says this time here and this time here and this time here, that's the time it was sent. And I'm going through the same process, trying to make sense out of the messages that I'm looking at. So I really, except that I was just being a historian. They were working under the pressure of knowing that it was a life and death situation.
Right. Amazing. Yes, Mr. Parker, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks very much. This was better than the movie. So in the movie, they showed up instances where the British had intelligence which they did not act on because they didn't want to let the Germans know that they had broken the code. Do we know of any instances where the Germans had intelligence and they didn't act for the same reason? So as not to disclose that they had the intelligence? First,
let's take that in two parts. There's a mythology around the British not acting. The famous myth is that Churchill knew that Coventry was going to be bombed and did nothing so as not to give away the secret. This is a myth. They did not know that Coventry was going to be bombed, and that's not why the Germans succeeded in bombing it. What they did do was do everything they could to hide the source of the information. So, for instance, they were constantly decoding also Italian naval messages, which were sent in a different form of Enigma, that told of convoys crossing the Mediterranean to bring supplies, and told which ships were carrying fuel. And fuel is even more important than arms. If you could cut the fuel supplies, then Rommel's out of gas, right? So what they did is they'd send out a reconnaissance plane. Now, that reconnaissance plane knew exactly where to look in the Mediterranean for the ship. But as far as the people on the ship knew, the reason that the RAF attacked them afterwards was that they'd been spotted by a reconnaissance plane, not that their code had been broken. In fact, there were a number of times when the Germans suspected that there was some sort of leak, and they conducted investigations to see if Enigma was being broken. And they always came up with an excuse to themselves of how the information had leaked in a different way, because they were so certain that Enigma couldn't be broken. Their hubris was about their technology was that great. On the other side of the story, the Germans themselves impressed. I mean, looking at their documents, what's mind-boggling is how careless they were. Just as an example, in these messages to Rommel, they kept using the same term for their source in Cairo, the good source. This is absolutely forbidden in code security. You don't keep identifying a source by the same name. You're telling somebody you have a specific source if your code is broken. But they were so confident that their code couldn't be broken that they didn't worry about that. They kept using the same phrase over and over again. One of the phrases that Bletchley Park used to break Enigma that they could expect was that there was a certain outpost in the Libyan desert from which a commander regularly sent the message. It was like out in the middle of the desert, nothing happened. He regularly sent a message that said nothing to report. And the repetition of that phrase was a key clue for breaking the daily Enigma settings. So they simply didn't believe that it could be broken. Before you think of this as ancient history from the Paleolithic age of 1942, think about your cybersecurity.
You just motivated me right after your program today. I have to change my password. Yeah.
But don't change it to something so long that you end up writing it down on a piece of paper and leaving it on your desk.
I actually have to throw out the old password piece of paper that's on my desk after I do that. I appreciate that very much. I'm really feeling embarrassed right now. Yeah, but it's okay. So I want to just I have a bunch of what interested you in this particular topic? How did you get here?
Well, look, big thing. I like good stories. I write about the Middle East. I love digging into the past and doing archival work. I'd finished my previous book. My ears were open for a good story. One Shabbat lunch, we had a couple over, good friends of ours, and my friend Daniel Avitzur starts telling me that during World War II, his mother and father were Jews living in Palestine. His father had signed up with the British Army and in fact became an officer. And at a certain point in the war, the British Army wanted to evacuate his mother from Palestine because of the expectation of a German conquest, and they were evacuating officers' families. His mother refused to be evacuated, but he said, this shows how immediate the threat was. Now, I obviously read a huge amount of Israeli history. I knew that there'd been a threat of Nazi conquest, but I hadn't had the sense of how immediate this was, right? And I said, I have to dig into this. And very quickly after I dug into it, I started seeing these really contradictory and bizarre references to this good source. It became clear to me that the pieces didn't fit together. And one of the reasons for that is that the earlier accounts had been written when the vast majority of the material was still classified, because the documents on which this book has been written in many cases remain classified for 50, 60s, even 70 years, not to mention the ones that I found in people's attics. So there was something known that there was this leak from Cairo, but the pieces didn't fit together. And I said, well, this is what I got to find out. And I became obsessed with it.
How many years did you research and write the book?
Danny told me this story in 2013, and I finished writing in 2020. And for most of that time, I was writing, I'm Shomer Shabbat, so I was researching or writing 24/6. Thank God for Shabbat. I would have driven myself into the ground without Shabbos.
Yeah, I think we all feel that way. And I've read reviews of the book and they've all been positive, and I hope they make it into a movie because it'd be a fantastic movie. I love how you also, I mean, it reads like a movie and reads like a thriller, and I couldn't believe it. There were moments I had to pinch myself because I couldn't believe it. This was factual. It's nonfiction, but I love at the beginning all of the cast of characters you had. It really helped at times when I was reading through the book to explain who was who, and as it really was a wonderful read, and I enjoyed it. I guess my question to you is, how have different countries responded to the book?
Well, um, the basic difference I will tell you is there's three sort of sets I can tell you here, because I haven't yet seen, although I hope to see reactions from Germany and Italy. But in the United States, the reaction is, "Oh my gosh, there was a war in North Africa," um, which started with people like when I was submitting the proposal. As I said, the conception of the war against Germany is there's Pearl Harbor, there's some sort of dead space, then there's Normandy, and then there's the Battle of the Bulge, and we won. Um, and the fact that North Africa and the Middle East was the major front for half the war has just slipped out of American consciousness, in large part because for most of that period, America wasn't in the war. And there's, this is one of the things I discuss in the book was the deep resentment that the British had about the Americans staying on the sidelines for so long. And it comes out in the comments of different characters, conversations. The Americans are sitting there safe on the other side of the Atlantic, and Britain's fighting the Nazis. And that carries on into the American historical narrative. So that's one thing. When I've spoken about it to audiences and gotten responses from Britain, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the response is much more engaged because there's a much larger number of people whose fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers were involved in this war. And in fact, I got an incredible email. I mean, it really brought tears to my eyes from a man whose father and father-in-law were in the New Zealand troops. And he said they thought they were just defending the colonial empire, and as colonials, they didn't even really know how much, like, what they were fighting for. And here I'm telling him that they prevented the Holocaust in the Middle East. He was just blown away. And I said, well, yes, they are the forgotten heroes who did this. And in Israel, there's another reaction, which is that, the Israeli story, for very good reason, stresses Jewish arms, Jewish military. And that's an essential part of our history, is defending ourselves. But one of the things that comes out of this, which we have to deal with, is we were saved at that point by the armies of the British Empire. That includes Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and the colonial army from India and so forth, and the Free French and the Free Polish and the Free Czechs. And yes, there was Jewish participation in that army, but the major factor was that for its own imperial reasons, Britain decided to fight for the Middle East. And that saved us. The Jews in Palestine survived the war for the same reason that the Jews in London or Moscow did, which is Allied armies finally stopped the Nazi army at a certain place, and Jews who lived beyond that spot lived on, and Jews who lived within the territory conquered by the Nazis were in the dark planet of the Holocaust. And when we tell our history, it's important to recognize that that is part of our history, I think. That Sikh soldiers from the Punjab are part of the reason that I can be speaking to you from Jerusalem today.
And it's fitting as we wind up the program that you know the miraculous blessing of Israel a couple years later, right? Is that, you know, given the opportunity after 1948, part of the burden of having an independent country is we have to defend it, and people, brave men and women, have given their lives for a dream that we had for 2,000 years, which in many ways
I want
brings
to
us full
add,
circle. Yeah.
I want to add something to what I said about this, though, about who fought. The second side of this is that the Jewish community in Palestine, its leadership, all but a tiny far-right extreme group, decided at the beginning of the war that despite their incredible anger, justified anger in my mind at the British for cutting off immigration, essentially for abandoning the Balfour Declaration, that my enemy's enemy is a greater enemy. That even though we have this conflict with the British, we're going to fight on the side of the British. And somewhere between 26 and 30,000 Jewish men and women out of a community of 600,000, really incredible number when you consider that they were all volunteers, volunteered for the British Army and learned to be soldiers there. And beyond that, there were others who made Aliyah in the years immediately after the war, who'd fought in Allied armies and reached Palestine. And that was the core. That training was the core of what created the Israeli army in 1948. So there's this amazing memoir by Gamal Abdel Nasser and another memoir by a fellow member of the young officers in Egypt when they're talking about the war in Palestine in 1948. And they thought, you know, we're just going to roll right in. We have a regular army, and there's a bunch of amateurs out there. So it's like, these gangs. And they smashed into the brand new Israeli army and found out that they were trained fighters. So the decision to fight with the British in the war, to understand that the world is complicated and that sometimes your allies and your enemies are, that it's a messy thing, that you can't have it pure. That decision was essential to the creation of the State of Israel. That pragmatism was essential to the State of Israel. And I think that, the situations are different, the situations are new, but we need to understand that our independence is interdependence and that international affairs are complicated, and to learn from that. And so as we go into Independence Day, I would like to celebrate Israeli interdependence, and thank you all for listening, and enjoy reading the book.
We want to thank you for a wonderful presentation today. We have tonight at 7:30 our program, the transition between Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Tekes Ma'avar, and we hope that you'll join us for that. And I just want to say one other thing, which is just to go to what you said, is that I think independence can be hard. It can be complicated. And even the relationship between American Jews and Israel can be complicated, but it doesn't need to be an enigma. And I think a lot of what I've thought about over as the last year, as many of us who used to go to Israel all the time, but with COVID haven't been able to go, is cracking the code, that we speak the same language. And your book is about when human beings are really fighting the good fight, when they're fighting evil, learn how to crack a code and speak a language and get on the same page, how they can do really good things. And I believe that that when American Jews in Israel, when we can really speak to one another and hear one another and be in the same room with one another, the potential is really endless. And may this Yom HaAtzmaut bring great things, not just the ability to be in the same room, but also to create, to continue the creation of a future that our children and grandchildren will really be able to be proud of and to celebrate one day. So friends, I want to thank everyone for being here for a wonderful presentation. And to our presenter today, Gershom, we can't wait to have you back. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Be my
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That was great.
Thank you
Amazing.
so much.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you,
It was
Rabbi
wonderful.
Shari.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Going to
Have a
buy the
good day.
book right now.
Buy the book. It's a good
Very
book.
Yes.